Hello, in this episode we are going to take a comparative look at the role of agriculture in different developing countries, in different regions, and at different stages in the economic development process, and very importantly, in terms of the incidence of poverty. One way to classify countries is with three systems of agriculture as follows. We have agriculture-based countries. These often practice extensively subsistence agriculture, but because agriculture has such a large role in the economy, such as 80% or more of the workforce involved in agriculture, agriculture represents a substantial share of the growth the country is able to realize. Then we have transforming countries. These are where most of the world's rural people are found, such as in India. And there's a large proportion of poverty incidence in these countries and in the rural areas in these countries. However, there's a lower contribution of agriculture to economic growth, as that growth is found more commonly in services and in manufacturing activities. And then finally, we have urbanized countries. In these countries, half or even more of the poor are now found in the urban areas. Brazil is an example. So the trend here in this schema is from agriculture-based toward transforming and then finally to urbanized economies. And this is illustrated in the case of 3 or 4 countries for figure 9.4. Here on the x-axis we have the rural poor as a share of the total poor. This is from the year 2002. On the y-axis we have agriculture's contribution to growth in this period of 1990 to 2005. With respect to our agriculture-based countries, agriculture has a high contribution to growth, and this is where, in rural areas, most of the poor are found. The transforming economies, we still find that the poor are concentrated in rural areas, but agriculture's contribution to growth is now smaller. And then finally, in urbanized economies, we find that the poor are quite often found in increasing fractions in the urban areas, even as agriculture's contribution to growth remains small. Here are some cases. India, in this time frame of this study, 1965 to 1994, moved from being a sort of quintessential agriculture-based economy towards becoming a transforming economy. In contrast, Indonesia, beginning in this period of 1970, having just become a transforming country by this schema, is moving from 1970 to 1996 clearly in the direction of becoming an urbanized country. Brazil, from 1970 to 1996, moves from being a transforming economy towards being a sort of quintessential urbanized economy. Certainly in Brazil, a large fraction of the poor are now found in urban areas, over 80% by some estimates. So we can also think about the different regions of the developing world as being a source for our comparison of agriculture. In terms of peasant farming, which is where we find the small-scale farming and many of the poor, we have different agriculture practices in Latin America, where some of this still exists, in Asia and in Africa. With Latin America and Asia, there are some similarities and there are some differences in the traditional sectors. In Latin America, in the traditional sectors, there is the tradition of the large plantation on the one hand and the very small family plots of land on the other, called latifundio and minifundio systems. This is the traditional pattern. Of course, there are also much more modern sectors in the economy with medium-sized farms. On the other hand, very fragmented and heavily congested, sometimes called dwarf landholdings in Asia, such as in South Asia, in which generation by generation, plots have become smaller. And so this is a different kind of small-scale farming. In Africa, where there's also small-scale farming, historically the pattern has been one of extensive cultivation, which has meant that there has been, in comparison to Asia, lots of land per person. So it's been possible to move cultivation from one set of areas after it becomes places of relative soil depletion to some other areas as the first area restores over time. And so we can see in the case of Asia in particular that colonial rule had a very substantial negative effect, as so often it does through its impact on institutions. This rule strengthened land tenure systems with private property rights that gave more control to those who became able to be designated as the landowners, and also led to a rise of the power of moneylenders. Very often in India and Pakistan, there's absentee landlords. Now, many farms are owned by the families who farm there, but there is a lot of rental, both renting the land in a traditional way and also sharecropping, an important topic that we will return to when we look at the microeconomics of agriculture in developing countries. So rapid population growth, now leveling off, but recently very rapid population growth in Asia has resulted in still more fragmentation of land, in some cases peasant impoverishment, which has still continued. So that with respect to Latin America, apart from these latifundios and minifundios, there's now much production in family farms and also medium-sized farms. The traditional latifundios are relatively inefficient. They have a lot of land in relation to labor, for example, whereas the minifundios have very little land in relation to labor. And so they're sometimes less focused on the business of farming. The owners of some of these are involved with politics. They're able to use their political clout for gains in other sectors, such as subsidies for industry, and so that their lower efficiency on these farms is sometimes things they can absorb in exchange for the economic benefits of political influence and just the social prestige that goes along with this role in your society. So overall, the agriculture sector nonetheless seems to be doing reasonably well in a number of Latin American countries, particularly in South America. A couple of examples are Chile, where there's been a lot of diversification towards different kinds of vegetables and fruits, some of these for exports, development of the wine sector, for example, and in Brazil with soybeans and to a large degree also in biofuels. But extreme rural inequalities continue to exist in many of these countries, even as they become much more highly urbanized in most of the cases. In terms of agriculture, there is still low productivity, as we've seen before. This is related to lack of use of technology. We've talked about that a bit in a previous episode. We'll look at it further momentarily. And again, this is in the context of what has historically been shifting cultivation practices, that you move from one area to the next once the first area has depletion of nutrients in the soil and so on. In terms of the rapid population growth in Africa, that's not really quite nearly as common as it used to be. There's seasonal demand for labor. It depends upon the rainy season. In some countries, there's a major rainy season and a less rainy season, the big rains and small rains. There's a still relatively higher fraction of underutilized land, though this fraction is falling. Very high concern about climate change impact in sub-Saharan Africa. Unfortunately, sub-Saharan Africa is likely to be the area of the world, geographical area of the world, that's most impacted in a negative way by climate change. South Asia, possibly second most negatively impacted. The need for an African new green revolution has been widely understood. It's been a focus of many development agencies and foundation donors in this century, and there's some hopeful signs that progress is getting underway. Here's a comparison of the use of modern inputs over 20-year periods, 1962, 1982, 2002. There's been some continued progress, but the patterns look broadly the same. with respect first to the share of arable and permanent cropland that have irrigation, very striking is how little irrigation there is and has been in sub-Saharan Africa. We still think this number is well under 7% of the land being irrigated. It's not because you don't need irrigation in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a lot of land that could be highly productive in the dry season with irrigation, such as horticulture production that one could sell to cities, for example, as well as improve rural nutrition. In contrast, 39% for South Asia, a very substantial figure. Similarly, for Middle East and North Africa, 33%, 29% for East Asia and Pacific. Turning next to the improved high-yielding variety of grains, or improved cereals, as it's sometimes called. Again, great differences by region. Sub-Saharan Africa, as of this data, just 22%. Still to this day, large areas in sub-Saharan Africa are being farmed with traditional grains, that is to say, saving from this year's harvest to use as your seeds for next season. In contrast, South Asia had reached 78% high-yielding modern varieties, and East Asia and the Pacific, 84%. These regions in Asia were the locus and focus, if you want, of the first green revolution from the 1960s. This is where the great concerns were on the part of donors about rapid population growth and risks of famine. Africa was viewed at this point in time as having much better development prospects. It has different climate and agricultural systems, so it has different needs for agricultural research and development. And so now, finally, that focus in sub-Saharan Africa is taking place. Finally, we'll talk about fertilizer consumption just very briefly. Sub-Saharan Africa, just 13%, as defined here, kilograms per hectare of arable land and permanent cropland. This compares with 13 kilograms compares with 190 kilograms in East Asia and Pacific, and 98 in South Asia. So in terms of kilograms per hectare, we also see a very dramatic difference, running from just 13 kilograms per hectare to 190. So this gives another way of looking at the differences, both in terms of classification of economies and in terms of averages of developing regions.